Imagine a secret so monstrous that even the most hardened detectives are left speechless, a secret hidden behind the closed doors of a seemingly ordinary home in a quiet Oklahoma suburb. Welcome to the case of the Molden family, a tale of shocking betrayal, unspeakable secrets, and a web of silence that has left an entire community in disbelief. It all began on an ordinary day in the Village, Oklahoma, a serene town where neighbors greet each other by name and life appears picture-perfect. But beneath the facade of this tranquil suburb, a sinister undercurrent was flowing. On that fateful day, police stormed the Molden residence, taking 3 family members into custody. What they discovered would unravel years of meticulously guarded secrets. The initial chaos started when DHS alerted officers about an 18-year-old, whose intellectual disabilities left her vulnerable in every way. In the early hours of July 2024, she gave birth, a birth surrounded by confusion, terror, and unanswered questions. In a hospital room bathed in harsh fluorescent lights, a teenage girl lay distraught, clutching a baby she never imagined she would have. When a nurse innocently asked, "Who is the father?" her hesitant reply sent a cold shiver down everyone's spine. Minutes later, the police arrived, and a routine DNA test was ordered. But what the test revealed was beyond anyone's worst nightmares. The results exposed a truth so vile, so disturbing, that even seasoned investigators found themselves reeling. This was not an accident, this was not a case of misplaced trust. It was a decades-long cover-up, a sinister conspiracy unfolding under the very noses of those who should have protected her. The evidence painted a picture of a house filled with secrets, a family that allowed a hidden horror to persist unchecked. And the most chilling part? The truth had been right in front of everyone, yet no one stepped in to stop it. At the heart of this dark saga was Nathaniel Molden Sr. A man whose quiet demeanor in the neighborhood masked a deeply controlling and volatile nature behind closed doors. By day, he was an unremarkable worker, a man seen leaving early and returning late, hardly engaging in any small talk. But those who truly knew him whispered of a man whose temper and strict rules made home life a living nightmare. Although he had never been formally convicted, his name was forever tainted by past domestic disturbances, as hinted at in old police reports. In the months leading up to his arrest, his secret online activities began to reveal a disturbing pattern that would eventually shake the foundation of the community. And then there was Tama Molden, a quiet presence who had faded into the background, her identity overshadowed by the relentless control of her husband. She had been the stay-at-home parent, the silent witness to the unraveling of a family under siege by secrets and lies. As the investigation deepened, every uncovered detail about the Molden household pointed to a chilling conclusion: an entire family had been complicit, whether by action or by silence, in perpetuating a cycle of abuse and hidden transgressions. In the next part of this story, we will peel back the layers of deception that shrouded the Molden family. How did a seemingly normal neighborhood become the stage for such unspeakable acts? Why did those around them fail to notice the warning signs? And most importantly, how did this family's silent complicity allow a monster to hide in plain sight? Stay tuned as we dive deeper into one of the most disturbing true crime cases in recent history, a case that will forever change the way you look at the concept of family, trust, and the secrets that can tear lives apart. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, because what comes next will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the people next door. Behind every seemingly ordinary facade lies a darkness that defies imagination. A darkness that can fester silently behind closed doors for years, eroding the very foundation of trust and love. In the quiet, unassuming streets of the Village, Oklahoma, the Molden family lived an existence that, to the outside world, appeared as commonplace as any other suburban household. Yet, beneath the veneer of normalcy, a slow, insidious horror was unfolding. For most of her life, the Molden mother was regarded as polite, reserved, and unremarkable, a woman whose quiet demeanor masked a haunting passivity. To her friends, she was known as someone who rarely challenged the decisions of her domineering husband. When questioned later by investigators about the unspeakable events that had transpired within her home, her response was one of hesitant silence. She neither confirmed nor outright denied the whispers of abuse that had spread like wildfire through the community. In situations like these, silence can be as damning as any confession. Then there was Nathaniel Molden Jr., a 19-year-old whose name would soon become synonymous with one of the most disturbing crimes in Oklahoma's history. At school, teachers painted a picture of a young man lacking ambition, a student who barely attended classes before eventually dropping out. But those who had shared his day-to-day life remembered a different persona, a cunning, manipulative figure who knew how to twist the truth to his own advantage. As the eldest child, he was expected to protect his younger sister, yet instead, he exploited her vulnerability. For 2 harrowing years, he preyed on her innocence, a betrayal so profound that it shattered any illusion of familial duty or protection. He took advantage of someone who was incapable of fully comprehending the situation, someone who had no means to defend herself. At the heart of this tragic narrative stands the young woman whose voice was tragically stifled by a lifetime of neglect and abuse. For privacy, her name remains unspoken, but her story resonates with an urgency that demands to be told. Born with an intellectual disability and burdened with an IQ of just 49, she struggled with the simplest of decisions, an existence where basic social cues and self-advocacy, which most take for granted, were out of reach. Enrolled in a special education program at the local high school, she was given lessons meant to equip her for life, yet she was isolated, devoid of a true social circle or a confidant in whom to place her trust. In the one place that should have offered sanctuary, her home, she instead found herself ensnared in a network of betrayal. Her own brother, the one who should have been her guardian, became the architect of her exploitation, using his position within the family to inflict harm upon her. Equally complicit was her mother, whose quiet acquiescence and deliberate inaction allowed the abuse to continue unchallenged. And then there was her father, a man whose very presence lent an air of enforced acceptance to the unthinkable, a man whose enabling silence transformed the household into a breeding ground for unspeakable acts. Outsiders, observing only the surface, saw the Moldens as just another family, a collection of neighbors leading ordinary lives. Yet for those who dared to look closer, the cracks in the foundation became impossible to ignore. The household was not a bastion of love and security, but rather a chamber of secrets and unvoiced suffering. It was a place where the most vulnerable were left unprotected, where power dynamics were grossly misused, and where every act of silence deepened the wounds of betrayal. As the investigation unfolded, questions piled upon one another like the heavy, oppressive clouds before a storm. How could a family, in a town where everyone knew everyone else, harbor such a horrifying truth in plain sight? What failed in the system that allowed a mother's quiet resignation, a father's enabling, and a brother's calculated cruelty to persist for years? And perhaps most disturbingly, how did the community remain oblivious to the mounting signs of abuse, a community that, in retrospect, might have been able to intervene if only they had seen the warning signs? This is not just a story about one family's fall from grace, it is a stark reminder of the dangers that can hide in the most unassuming places. The case of the Molden family is a chilling testament to how silence can be as complicit as overt actions, how a lack of intervention can transform a household into a crucible of suffering, and how the price of ignoring the cries of the vulnerable can be unimaginably high. In the coming chapters of this investigation, we will peel back every layer of deception, examine every missed opportunity for intervention, and confront the painful truths that many would prefer to keep hidden. Prepare to journey with us into the heart of darkness, a place where every unanswered question, every whispered secret, and every act of inaction adds up to a legacy of pain and betrayal. This is a story that will challenge your perceptions of family, expose the devastating impact of unchecked silence, and force us all to ask, how many more dark secrets are hidden behind closed doors, waiting for the light of truth to expose them? In that fateful July night, as the hospital corridor hummed with quiet urgency, a nurse leaned over the bedside, her gentle tone belying the gravity of the situation. "Can you tell me what happened?" she asked softly, careful not to startle the young mother cradling her newborn. In that moment, the sterile white walls and the soft beeping of monitors were the only witnesses to a tragedy years in the making. Behind those walls, the echoes of a shattered family reverberated. A family defined by a controlling father who ruled with an iron fist, a mother ensnared in the web of her own denial, and a son whose manipulation had inflicted irreparable damage on his own sister. For years, the Molden household had been a silent theater of torment, where whispers and warnings echoed in the dead of night, yet no one dared to pry into the secrets behind closed doors. Outside, the Molden residence stood like a fortress of solitude in the village Oklahoma, a quiet neighborhood where families shared warm smiles and community events were the norm. Yet, the Molden home was an anomaly. It was a place where children rarely played in the sunlit yards and where the festive aroma of family barbecues was replaced by an eerie hush. Neighbors recalled disjointed moments, raised voices that morphed into haunting screams, slamming doors in the dead of night, and a persistent, unsettling presence of Nathaniel Jr., whose eyes seemed to linger on his sister long after his visits were over. These were not the normal sounds of a typical household, they were the ominous preludes to a horror that no one dared to acknowledge. The warnings had started years earlier. In 2018, a compassionate teacher at the local high school noted a drastic change in the quiet, withdrawn girl who once sat in class with a timid smile. Her eyes, usually vacant of fear, now flickered with anxiety, and she flinched at even the slightest unexpected movement. The teacher, troubled by these signs, filed a report with social services, convinced that something sinister was brewing behind the Molden home's closed doors. But when a caseworker arrived, Tama Molden, ever the epitome of quiet denial, dismissed the concerns with a calm that belied the growing storm within. "She's just always been a bit shy," she insisted, and with that, the investigation was abruptly closed. Yet behind that placid exterior, the situation at home only worsened. Over the years, disturbing patterns emerged. Nathaniel Sr. and Tamika Molden were not strangers to the dark corners of their own making. On multiple occasions, they had caught their son engaging in unspeakable acts with his sister, each time responding not with alarm or a call for help, but with a cold, calculated attempt to restore order through punishment. They believed that by silencing the matter, by punishing both and expecting the cycle to end, they could bury the horror deep enough that it would never resurface. But silence, as it is often said, never truly conceals the truth. When their daughter became pregnant, the family was forced into a harrowing crossroads. They could have chosen to confront the disgrace, to expose the vile truths that festered beneath their roof, or they could choose silence, a silence so profound that it swallowed every cry for help. They chose the latter, burying their darkest secret beneath layers of denial and fear. But secrets, no matter how deeply hidden, have a way of clawing their way to the surface. That July 2024 call to the Oklahoma Department of Human Services was the spark that ignited the long-dormant inferno. The 18-year-old, now a young mother, had given birth at a local hospital, a case that, on the surface, appeared to be just another teenage pregnancy. Yet, as the nurse's gentle inquiry broke the hushed monotony of the hospital room, it became painfully clear that this was no ordinary case. The young mother's eyes, filled with confusion and sorrow, seemed to plead for someone to understand the depth of her suffering. It wasn't just a single moment of abuse, it was an intricate tapestry of neglect, manipulation, and betrayal that had been woven over years. Every unspoken word, every dismissive shrug by those in power, and every fearful glance from neighbors had contributed to the tragedy. The DNA results, which were soon to arrive, would confirm the unthinkable, that the silent complicity of an entire family had allowed a cycle of abuse to persist unchecked. As investigators began to unravel the threads of this dark tapestry, they discovered that the Molden household was not isolated in its dysfunction. Neighbors recalled fleeting images of a man with a cold, calculating stare, a young girl whose laughter had long since been replaced by silence, and a house that, at night, pulsed with secrets and sorrows. The local community, known for its close-knit ties, was now forced to confront a chilling reality, that the evil lurking behind one unassuming home could shatter lives and tarnish the very essence of what it meant to be a family. Over the following weeks, the story of the Molden family would spread through the town like wildfire. Community members began to share their recollections of eerie sounds and unsettling behavior, a collage of evidence that painted a portrait of neglect and deliberate inaction. The once quiet streets of the village were now abuzz with whispered speculations and anguished questions. How many warnings had been ignored? Could anyone have intervened if only they had dared to ask the right questions? And most heartbreakingly, how had a young girl been robbed of the future she deserved? The investigation deepened, and every interview with neighbors, former teachers, and even distant relatives only added layers of complexity to the already harrowing narrative. It became painfully evident that the Molden family had not only harbored a dark secret but had actively cultivated an environment where abuse could thrive, hidden from the world by a veil of forced normalcy and mutual denial. The silence they had chosen to embrace was not one of peace, but one of calculated abandonment, a silence that had cost a young life its innocence and robbed her of the chance to forge her own destiny. Now, as law enforcement prepared to piece together every fragment of evidence, from the whispered rumors of the neighborhood to the haunting recollections of school staff, the full magnitude of the tragedy began to emerge. This was a case that transcended the typical boundaries of family disputes and delved into the realm of unspeakable criminality. It was a story of power abused, trust shattered, and a community left reeling from the revelations of how deeply one family's darkness could impact so many lives. And so, as the nurse's question lingered in that sterile hospital room, the entire community braced itself for the storm of truth that was about to break over them. The Molden family, once cloaked in the guise of suburban normalcy, was now exposed, a stark reminder that evil can hide in the most ordinary places. The silence had finally been broken, and the world was about to learn the true cost of turning a blind eye. In the coming days, as the investigation continued and more voices joined the chorus demanding accountability, one thing became clear: the tragic legacy of the Molden family would forever change the way we look at the sanctity of the home, the duty to protect the vulnerable, and the profound danger of silence. The interrogation room was cold and sterile, its white walls bearing silent testimony to the gravity of the case. Detective Harper leaned forward, his eyes locked onto Nathaniel Molden Jr., whose defiant facade was beginning to crumble under the weight of the evidence. "We have the DNA report, Nathaniel," Harper said, his tone measured yet unyielding. "The tests speak for themselves. You are the father of this child." For a long moment, Nathaniel's gaze wavered, fear and confusion mingling in his eyes as his earlier proclamations of innocence faltered. Outside the interrogation room, the atmosphere at the Molden residence was one of utter chaos. In the dim early morning light, police vehicles lined the street like silent sentinels, their flashing lights reflecting off the dew-soaked pavement. Neighbors, who had once regarded the Molden home as an impenetrable fortress of secrecy and isolation, now whispered in hushed tones about the dark revelations that were unfolding. The community's sense of normalcy was shattered as long-held suspicions turned into cold, hard facts. Inside the home, frantic voices and hurried steps echoed through the halls. Officers meticulously combed through every room, gathering evidence that painted a disturbing picture of years of neglect and abuse. In one small study, digital devices revealed a trail of online searches and messages, ominous clues that hinted at a much larger network of control and manipulation orchestrated by Nathaniel Molden Sr. Every discarded object, every hidden note, contributed to a growing mosaic of betrayal that had been meticulously concealed from the outside world. Back in the interrogation room, Detective Harper methodically questioned Nathaniel Jr. "Tell me," he pressed, "how did these events start? What led you to commit these acts?" Nathaniel's voice, shaky and unsteady, stuttered out fragmented explanations. At first, he insisted he hadn't done anything, his protests punctuated by desperate pleas of innocence. But as the detective laid out the forensic evidence, DNA matches that irrefutably connected him to the newborn, the young man's resolve began to waver. His eyes darted to the door as if seeking escape, yet no such outlet existed in that room of truth. Meanwhile, the victim, a young woman whose life had been upended by a series of unspeakable betrayals, sat in a quiet, guarded corner of the hospital. Her limited ability to communicate, a result of an intellectual disability, made her testimony all the more heartrending. With a tremor in her voice, she recounted the events that led to that fateful night. I thought he was my boyfriend," she whispered haltingly, her eyes welling with tears as she recalled how, under the pressure of confusion and fear, she had clung to the only explanation that made sense in that overwhelming moment. But when pressed, her hesitant glances and broken words hinted at a much more disturbing truth, a truth that had been obscured by the suffocating silence imposed by her family. The investigation quickly escalated. DHS caseworkers, initially perplexed by the girl's conflicting accounts, soon discovered inconsistencies in the narrative provided by her mother, Tama Molden. When confronted with the evidence, Tama's responses were evasive, her eyes filled with a sorrow that betrayed her outward calm. Despite her insistence that the child's father was merely a neighborhood boyfriend, her body language, and the desperate, almost pleading glances exchanged with her daughter, told another story entirely. As more evidence emerged, it became clear that this was not a simple case of teenage indiscretion. It was a deeply rooted, systematic abuse that had been allowed to fester behind closed doors for far too long. Within days, the full scope of the horror was laid bare. The Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation, OSBI, confirmed that the DNA from every male in the household was meticulously compared, and the results left no room for doubt. The perpetrator was not the man who ruled the household with a silent, domineering presence, nor was he some unknown figure lurking in the shadows. The abuser was the very person entrusted with her protection, a brother who had manipulated and exploited his own flesh and blood. The revelation sent shockwaves through the investigation team, transforming a tragic case of neglect into a high-stakes criminal matter. As the arrest warrants were swiftly executed, law enforcement descended on the Molden home like a tidal wave. Officers moved in with precision, their voices commanding and resolute. Inside, Nathaniel Jr. was jolted from a fitful sleep by the sound of his mother's panicked cries and the harsh commands of police. "Nathaniel Molden Jr., you are under arrest," they declared. In those chaotic moments, his defiance melted away, replaced by a dawning realization of the gravity of his actions. His protests, now frantic and incoherent, echoed in the cramped room as his mother, still silent and resigned, watched in a state of disbelief and remorse. The ensuing hours were a blur of formalities and forensic procedures. At the Oklahoma County Sheriff's Office, Nathaniel Jr. was processed and confined to a small, stark interrogation room where every detail of the case was scrutinized. Detective Harper, armed with the inarguable evidence and the victim's hesitant yet damning testimony, began to reconstruct the timeline of events. The narrative that emerged was one of relentless control, a household where authority was twisted into a weapon, where a father's neglect and a mother's silence had paved the way for unspeakable acts. Every detail of the victim's account, though fragmented by her limited understanding, painted a picture of a young life marred by betrayal and abuse, a life that had been cruelly hijacked by those who were supposed to protect her. The community, reeling from the revelations, grappled with a mixture of outrage, disbelief, and sorrow. Neighbors recalled vague, unsettling memories, the sound of raised voices that were not merely arguments but cries of agony, the peculiar behavior of Nathaniel Jr., whose presence around his sister had always been unsettling, and the eerie quiet that enveloped the Molden home, a silence that now spoke volumes. Local media picked up the story, and soon, the case of the Molden family became a focal point of a broader conversation about the failure of systems designed to protect the most vulnerable. Questions were raised about the missed opportunities for intervention, the inadequacies of the social services system, and the profound impact of a community's reluctance to question the status quo. In the weeks that followed, the investigation expanded beyond the walls of the Molden home. Testimonies from teachers, neighbors, and even distant relatives were meticulously gathered, each account adding a layer of depth to the harrowing narrative. The tragic story of a young woman, robbed of a future she had every right to shape, became a symbol of the systemic failures that allow abuse to continue in silence. As law enforcement and social services collaborated to ensure that no stone was left unturned, the case began to take on national significance, a stark reminder that even in the most seemingly ordinary communities, darkness can hide in plain sight. As the trial loomed on the horizon, the community braced itself for a reckoning, a confrontation with the unvarnished truth that had been hidden for so long. The courtroom would soon become the stage where every neglected warning, every silenced cry, and every moment of inaction would be laid bare for the world to see. And in that moment of public reckoning, the hope was that the voices of the voiceless would finally be heard, and that the scars inflicted by a family's dark secrets would begin to heal. This is not just a story of a single family's downfall, it is a cautionary tale, a call to vigilance, and a reminder of the importance of speaking up when something feels amiss. As the echoes of that fateful night continue to reverberate through the village Oklahoma, one thing is certain: the legacy of silence can be broken, and justice, no matter how delayed, will eventually prevail. The silence in the interrogation room was deafening, a heavy, suffocating quiet that pressed down on everyone present. Nathaniel Molden Jr. S. hands trembled uncontrollably as he sat slumped in his chair, the weight of his guilt finally beginning to crack his hardened facade. His whispered confession came out in halting fragments, barely audible over the relentless hum of fluorescent lights. "My parents," he finally managed, voice barely rising above a ragged whisper. His admission hung in the air like a dark omen. Across town, in separate interrogation rooms, both Nathaniel Molden Sr. and Tamika Molden faced their own grim reckoning. When pressed by detectives about their awareness of the unspeakable abuse, each offered feeble denials. Nathaniel Sr. insisted, "I had no idea," his tone a practiced mix of shock and indignation, as if he truly believed that a man like him could never allow such a thing. Tamika, with a tremor in her voice that betrayed years of repressed anxiety, repeated the same tired line, "I would never let something like that happen." Yet the mounting evidence told a different story. Investigators had uncovered a digital trail that could not be ignored. Disturbing searches on Nathaniel Sr.'s phone, queries like, "How to corrupt a DNA test," and, "Do siblings have the same DNA?" had been made mere hours before the official results confirmed what everyone had feared. The timestamps on those searches painted a chilling picture: a man who knew exactly what was unfolding under his roof and who desperately tried to cover it up. With this new evidence, the detectives pieced together the entire harrowing timeline. The Molden parents had been aware, at every step, of the abuse that had festered within their home. Instead of intervening, they chose to punish both their son and daughter, a decision that was meant to stifle any further disclosure but only served to deepen the tragedy. Back in the interrogation room, the detectives laid down the cold, unassailable facts. Nathaniel Jr., now visibly broken, was formally charged with incest. An accusation that carried the weight of not only a criminal act but a betrayal of the most sacred familial bonds. In stark contrast, his parents faced charges of child neglect, their inaction and active cover-up emerging as damning evidence of a broader systemic failure. For years, the family had shrouded their darkest secrets behind a veneer of normalcy, but now, with every lie exposed, there was no escaping the truth. By October 2024, the case had exploded into a full-blown public scandal. Nathaniel Molden Jr. was confined to the Oklahoma County Detention Center, while his parents, Nathaniel Sr. and Tamika, were released on bail, an outcome that sparked outrage among community members who demanded a harsher punishment. The public outcry was relentless. Local activists, parents, and even distant relatives called for justice not only for the direct victims but for every child left vulnerable by the failures of those entrusted with their care. At the center of this maelstrom was the young woman whose life had been irrevocably shattered. Now placed in state custody along with her newborn baby, she was taken into the protective arms of social workers and medical professionals. Yet, the path to recovery promised to be long and arduous. Her intellectual disability, which had made her an easy target for exploitation, now posed a formidable barrier to healing. Every day, as she navigated a world that had betrayed her, she was forced to confront the brutal reality that her family, the very people who were meant to nurture and protect her, had instead exploited her vulnerability. The repercussions of the Molden case rippled far beyond the walls of a single home. Neighbors, once complacent in their quiet community, began to speak out about the eerie occurrences they had witnessed. Whispers of raised voices echoing down desolate streets at night, of unexplained sounds that sent shivers down the spine, and of the unnerving presence of Nathaniel Jr. Lingering too long near his sister became the subject of hushed conversations and heated debates. Teachers recalled the gradual transformation of a once quiet girl into someone visibly terrified, a change so subtle at first that it had almost gone unnoticed until it was too late. In a small town like the Village, Oklahoma, where everyone knew everyone else, the case exposed a deep-seated failure on multiple levels. Social services were questioned for their lack of timely intervention, and law enforcement faced scrutiny for missing opportunities to act on early warning signs. The chilling reality emerged: a network of neglect and denial had allowed abuse to continue unabated, leaving scars that would never fully heal. As legal proceedings loomed on the horizon, the community braced for a trial that promised to be as explosive as it was heartbreaking. The courtroom was set to become a battleground where every suppressed cry and every silenced testimony would be laid bare. Prosecutors vowed to pursue justice relentlessly, emphasizing that the case was not just about criminal acts but about a pervasive system of neglect and abuse that had been allowed to thrive in plain sight. The trial itself promised to be a long, grueling process, with each piece of evidence, a series of incriminating phone records, the damning DNA results, and the heartbreaking accounts of the victim, serving as a reminder of the deep betrayal that had taken place. For the victim, the courtroom would be a place where she would have to relive her worst nightmares, but it was also a critical step toward reclaiming her voice and seeking the justice long overdue. Community leaders and mental health advocates began to call for sweeping reforms in how potential abuse cases were handled. They argued that early intervention could have prevented the tragedy if only the subtle signs had been taken seriously. "We must do better," one local activist declared at a community meeting. "We need a system that listens, that acts, and that protects the vulnerable before it's too late." Their impassioned pleas resonated with many, sparking renewed discussions about child protection laws and the importance of community vigilance. Yet, even as the legal and social reforms took shape, the personal cost of the Molden tragedy continued to echo through the lives of those directly affected. The victim, now living in a foster system that promised care and protection, faced an uncertain future. Every day was a battle to rebuild her shattered self-esteem and to overcome the complex trauma inflicted by years of abuse, a trauma compounded by her inability to fully understand or articulate the pain. The newborn baby, an innocent byproduct of a horrific betrayal, would grow up with questions about his origins, a legacy of pain that would challenge any efforts at healing. The story of the Molden family serves as a grim reminder of the consequences when those entrusted with protection become the very source of harm. It forces us to confront uncomfortable questions: how many other hidden tragedies lie behind closed doors? What systemic failures allowed such a cycle of abuse to persist undetected for so long? And, crucially, how can we, as a society, ensure that silence is never mistaken for consent, that neglect is never accepted as normal? As the investigation closed one chapter of a long and harrowing ordeal, it opened the door to a broader call for accountability and change. The case of the Molden family, marked by its layers of betrayal, silence, and deception, will continue to reverberate through the halls of justice and the hearts of a community determined to break the cycle of abuse. If this story has struck a chord with you, if you believe that no one should have to endure such a betrayal of trust, then speak up. Share your thoughts, your experiences, and your ideas on how we can create a safer environment for everyone. In the comments below, let us know what changes you believe could prevent another tragedy like this from ever happening again. And if you found this investigation compelling, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more in-depth, hard-hitting stories that peel back the layers of our society's darkest secrets. Thank you for watching. Until next time, stay informed, stay aware, and always stand up for those who cannot stand up for themselves.